There are moments in history that the headlines miss completely, not because they aren't significant, but because they don't fit the narrative that everyone has already decided to tell. The world was watching Artemis II for the rocket, for the record, for the engineering triumph. Cameras were rolling, journalists were typing, millions of people were streaming the launch. And in the middle of all of that, something happened that almost nobody reported. Something that had nothing to do with fuel systems or orbital mechanics or mission objectives. Something ancient moved through that spacecraft, and by the time the crew was 250,000 miles from home, floating in the silence between the Earth and the Moon, it surfaced. Quietly, powerfully, in a way that no mission briefing had prepared anyone for. This is that story. Oh, not the story NASA told, not the story the news covered, the deeper story, the one that has been unfolding since long before any rocket was ever built. Inside the Orion capsule, among the instruments and the systems, and the carefully packed equipment designed to sustain 4 human lives in one of the most hostile environments in the known universe, there was a Bible. A family Bible. It wasn't there because of a mission requirement. It wasn't listed in any technical document. It traveled because someone understood something that engineers sometimes forget, that human beings are not just bodies kept alive by oxygen and calories. We are souls. And souls carry things that don't show up on a weight manifest. That Bible crossed space. It passed beyond the orbit of any space station, beyond the comfortable range of low Earth orbit, yet beyond every boundary that separates the familiar from the truly unknown. And it came back. Quietly. Without fanfare. The way truth usually travels. But before we get to what happened on that mission, we need to understand something about the kind of people who go to space. Because there is a misconception that floats around in popular culture. The idea that science and faith are enemies. That the more educated someone becomes, the less room there is for God. That astronauts of all people, surrounded by physics and data and engineering, would be the last ones to speak about creation, or prayer, or the love of Jesus Christ. History has never supported that idea. And Artemis II buried it completely. The crew was made up of 4 remarkable human beings. Reed Wiseman, the mission commander, a Navy test pilot who had already spent time aboard the International Space Station. Victor Glover, a naval aviator, a man of deep and openly expressed Christian faith who had also previously served aboard the ISS Christina Koch, a research engineer who had set the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, and Jeremy Hansen, a Canadian astronaut and Air Force colonel who was about to become the first Canadian to travel beyond low Earth orbit. 4 people, 4 different backgrounds, 1 mission. And together they were about to travel further from Earth than any human being since the final Apollo missions, over half a century earlier. The Orion capsule launched and began its journey. It crossed distances that are almost impossible to hold in your mind. 252,000 miles from Earth. Let that number sit for a moment. If you drove a car at highway speed without stopping, no gas, no sleep, no brakes, it would take you roughly 5 months to cover that distance. These 4 people covered it in days. They crossed it in a capsule roughly the size of a large minivan, sealed against the vacuum of space. Protected from radiation by layers of engineered material, kept alive by systems that had to work perfectly every single time. And then the moon appeared. Not the moon as you and I see it, a silver disk in a familiar sky. The moon as it truly is, a vast, ancient, cratered world hanging in absolute blackness, lit by a sun that looked smaller than it does from Earth, but burned with a ferocity that nothing in our daily life prepares us for. And beyond the moon, in every direction, nothing, on the deep black of space that has no floor, no ceiling, no walls. Just infinite distance in every direction. And slowly the Orion capsule began to move behind the moon. As it did, something extraordinary happened to the radio signal. It weakened, stretched, and then silence. The capsule passed into what mission controllers call the far side blackout. a zone where the moon itself blocks every signal between the spacecraft and the Earth. For a period of time, those four human beings were completely, totally, unreachably alone. No voice from Houston, no data link, no communication with a single other human being on Earth. Just four souls in a capsule on the far side of the moon. What happens to a person in that moment? What rises to the surface when every distraction is removed, when every connection to normal life is severed, when the silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat and the hum of the life support systems and absolutely nothing else? This is something that astronauts have struggled to fully describe for decades. There is a term for it, the overview effect, and it was first given that name by the writer Frank White in 1987, after he had interviewed dozens of astronauts about what they experienced in space. But the phenomenon itself is far older than any name we've given it. What happens is this: when a human being looks at the Earth from the outside, truly from the outside, not in a photograph or a film, but with their own eyes, from their own position in space, something in their perception permanently shifts. The boundaries they grew up understanding as real, national borders, racial lines, political divisions, the walls that human beings build between themselves and each other, they don't just look smaller from space, they look invisible. Because from space, they are invisible. You cannot see them. You can only see one thing. One continuous, fragile, breathtakingly beautiful world, hanging in a darkness so vast that the world itself seems like a miracle simply for existing at all. Edgar Mitchell walked on the moon during Apollo 14. He was a naval officer, an aeronautical engineer, a man trained in the hardest sciences. And on the journey back to Earth, looking out the window of his capsule, he experienced something he spent the rest of his life trying to describe. He said that he was suddenly filled with an absolute certainty, not a feeling, not an emotion, but a knowing, that the universe was not an accident, that it was intelligent, that it was alive in some way that his scientific training had no category for. He called it a moment of instant global consciousness. Others would call it something simpler: a meeting with God. Mitchell was not alone. Over and over again, across decades of space exploration, astronauts have returned to Earth changed. Not just professionally, spiritually. Something they saw out that window rearranged something inside them. And for many of them, what it rearranged was their understanding of who or what was behind the universe they had just traveled through. The Artemis II crew experienced their version of this, and the world caught a glimpse of it on Easter Sunday. During a scheduled live transmission from the Orion capsule, the crew gathered to communicate with Earth. It was April, it was Easter, and astronaut Victor Glover, before the transmission ended, said something that no one had scripted for him. He said he had nothing prepared. He spoke from whatever was in his heart at that moment, suspended between the Earth and the moon on the morning of the resurrection. He said, "I believe these celebrations are important. And while we are so far from Earth, looking at the beauty of creation, for me, one of the most personal perspectives up here is that I can see the Earth as one single thing. One single thing. Not America, not Canada, not any of the nations or cultures or factions that divide the surface of that world. One creation, one home, one object of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary fragility, placed in exactly the right position, at exactly the right distance from exactly the right kind of star, in exactly the right kind of galaxy, and to sustain the one thing in the known universe that looks back at all of it and asks why." Glover didn't stop there. He spoke about the beauty of creation. He used that word deliberately as in creation. Not formation, not development, not the product of random physical processes. Creation, the word that implies a creator. And he spoke it naturally, without apology, from 250,000 miles away on Easter Sunday. Then Jeremy Hansen spoke, and what he said connected the moment to something even deeper. Hansen spoke about the message of love that is at the heart of the teachings of Jesus Christ. He spoke about what this mission represented beyond the science, the unity of human beings across every difference, the hope that something larger than any one nation's ambitions was at work in the universe. And he spoke those words from the edge of human exploration, and they echoed back to Earth across the silence of space. This was not the first time something like this had happened. Go back to December 24th, 1968. The world is in the middle of one of the most turbulent years in modern history. Assassinations, war, civil unrest. The year 1968 had shaken nearly every assumption Western civilization had built its confidence upon. And on Christmas Eve, 3 men were orbiting the moon for the first time in human history. William Anders, Jim Lovell, and Frank Borman, the crew of Apollo 8, were not theologians. They were military pilots and engineers. But before they left Earth, a NASA public affairs officer named Julian Scheer had told them simply, "You'll be speaking to more people than anyone has ever spoken to before. Think about what you want to say." They thought about it, and what they decided to say was this. Anders began, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Lovell continued. Borman read the final verses, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 10, the creation of the world, read aloud from lunar orbit, on Christmas Eve, to an audience estimated at 1 billion human beings. The astronaut Buzz Aldrin, 7 months later, would take communion on the surface of the moon before he and Neil Armstrong stepped outside. He radioed back to Earth and asked everyone listening to give thanks in their own way. Across decades of space exploration, Bibles have flown aboard spacecraft. Prayers have been spoken in the void. Faith has traveled with the astronauts every single time. Not as a contradiction of the science that put them there, but as the only adequate response to what the science revealed when they arrived. Because here is the thing that never quite makes it into the textbooks. The more precisely we measure the universe, the more extraordinary it becomes. Physicists talk about what they call the fine-tuning problem. The fact that the fundamental constants of the universe, the numbers that govern how matter and energy interact, are calibrated with a precision that defies any reasonable accounting by chance. If the gravitational constant were slightly different, stars wouldn't form. If the electromagnetic force were slightly weaker, chemistry wouldn't work. If the cosmological constant, the energy density of empty space, were even fractionally larger, the universe would have expanded too fast for anything to coalesce into galaxies, stars, planets, or life. As the physicist Freeman Dyson once said, "The universe in some sense knew we were coming." He was not a religious man making a theological argument. He was a physicist making an observation. The numbers fit. They fit too well. They fit in the way that a key fits a lock. Not approximately, not close enough, but precisely, perfectly, as if designed. The astronauts of Artemis II didn't need a physics textbook to feel this. They had windows, they had eyes, they had the Earth floating before them in the darkness, and they had the question that every honest human being eventually asks when they look at something too beautiful to be an accident. Who made this? The answer to that question is not new. It predates every space agency, every telescope, every civilization that has ever looked up and wondered. King David wrote it from a hillside in ancient Israel, watching the stars wheel overhead. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Psalm 19, verse 1. He had no rocket. He had no spacecraft. He had no way to travel to the moon or measure the distance to the nearest star. But he looked up, and he saw what Victor Glover saw from inside the Orion capsule. The signature of a creator written in light across an infinite canvas. Job, perhaps the oldest book in the entire biblical canon, made an observation about the earth that would not be scientifically confirmed for thousands of years. He wrote, "He suspends the earth over nothing." Job 26, verse 7. And in an ancient world where every other culture imagined the earth resting on the back of an animal or supported by pillars or floating on a great cosmic sea, Job wrote the truth. The earth hangs in space, over nothing, held there not by any physical support but by the invisible architecture of the laws God built into the fabric of creation. The Artemis II crew looked out their windows and saw exactly that. Earth, hanging, over nothing. Exactly as Job described it. Exactly as God designed it. Isaiah, writing 7 centuries before the birth of Christ, issued what sounds today like a direct command to every astronaut who has ever looked back at Earth from the darkness of space. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? Isaiah 40, verse 26. Lift up your eyes. Yeah, the Artemis II crew lifted them 252,000 miles higher than the rest of us. And when they did, the answer came. Not from a mission controller, not from a flight manual, not from any instrument in the capsule. It came from somewhere deeper, from whatever it is in a human being that knows, in the presence of true beauty, that beauty doesn't make itself. And then there is Paul. Writing from a Roman prison cell 2,000 years ago, Paul described the cosmic scope of the Christ he had encountered on the road to Damascus. He wrote in his letter to the Colossians, "For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things have been created through him and for him." Colossians 1, verse 16. All things. The stars the astronauts passed, the darkness between them, the moon they orbited, the Earth they left behind. The laws of physics that kept their capsule on course. All of it. In him, through him, for him. When Victor Glover looked at the Earth and said, "I see the beauty of creation," he was, whether he fully realized it or not, looking at the work of Christ. The universe is not an anonymous product of blind forces. It is the work of a person who later entered it, who walked on the surface of the very world the astronauts photographed from the lunar horizon, who died for the people who live on it, and who rose. On the same day that Victor Glover floated between the Earth and the moon and spoke, unscripted, about the beauty of what God had made. Easter Sunday. Deep space. A man looking at a world he helped create, speaking about the love of the one who created it. There are no coincidences at this scale. Scientists have now mapped billions of galaxies. They have pointed their instruments at every corner of the observable universe. They have searched systematically, rigorously, with the most powerful tools human beings have ever built, for another world like Earth. And they have not found one. Not one planet with the right size, the right mass, the right atmospheric composition, the right distance from the right kind of star, the right geological activity, the right magnetic field, the right moon to stabilize its axial tilt, the right position in the right kind of galaxy. Not one. Out of billions of candidates, Earth is, as far as any instrument can determine, singular, unique, alone in its suitability for the kind of life that looks back at the stars and asks who put them there. That is not a statistical footnote. That is a statement about the nature of the universe. And it points, as the astronauts of Artemis II understood in their own way, floating in the silence beyond the moon, toward something, someone, a deliberate architect whose work is visible in every direction from inside a spacecraft, in every direction from your backyard, in every direction from wherever you are reading or listening to these words right now. You do not need a spacecraft. You do not need a launch date or a mission patch or a seat in a capsule. The same creation that surrounded the Artemis II crew at 252,000 miles surrounds you right now. The same sky that spoke to David speaks tonight. The same God who hung the earth over nothing holds everything in place this moment. And the same Jesus whose resurrection was quietly honored by an astronaut in deep space on Easter Sunday, that same Jesus is available to you. Not as a historical figure, not as a concept, as a living person who entered the creation he made because he loved the people living in it. John 3:16, perhaps the most compressed statement of the most important truth ever written, says it this way: "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." God loved this world, the fragile blue sphere, the one hanging over nothing in the darkness, the one that looks from the moon like the most precious and improbable thing in the universe. He loved it enough to enter it, to live in it, to die for the people on it, and to rise on a Sunday morning, so that death itself would no longer be the final word for anyone who chooses to believe. That is the message that traveled to the moon and back inside that Bible. That is the message that came through the lips of an astronaut on Easter Sunday from a 250,000 miles away. That is the message that the heavens have been declaring since the first moment light existed. And it is a message meant for you. If you have never responded to it, today is as good a day as any. You don't need a church building or a formal ceremony. You don't need to have your life together or your questions answered. You just need to be honest. You can say in your own words something like this: Jesus, I believe you are real. I believe you made this world and you love the people in it. But I believe you died for me and rose again. Today I choose you. Come into my life, forgive what needs forgiving, and lead me from this day forward. Amen. If that prayer came from something real in you, then something real just happened. Not because of the words, because of the one the words were addressed to. The same one whose signature is written in the fine-tuning constants of physics, in the precise orbit of the Earth, in the exact distance to the sun, in the depth of the oceans, in the tilt of the axis, in the face of every person you have ever loved. The heavens are still declaring his glory. The Artemis II crew lifted their eyes and saw it. Now it's your turn.